Edinburgh, 1700, the city of stone, smoke, and shadows at the edge of the known world, where wind from the North Sea carried salt, smoke, and whispered prayers. Stood a city stacked upon itself, dark, defiant, and alive. In the year 1700, Edinburgh was not a place of comfort. It was a place of survival, a city where sermons thundered louder than cannons, where stone buildings blocked out the sun, and where every narrow alley carried secrets, some whispered, some screamed. This is not the story of castles alone. This is the story of ordinary lives trapped between faith and fear, ambition and hunger, tradition and a future they could not yet see. This is Edinburgh at the dawn of a new century. The city on the ridge at the dawn of the 18th century. Edinburgh lay stretched along its narrow backbone of rock, like a city deliberately balanced between survival and defiance. The ridge itself was ancient, jagged, and unforgiving, a spine of hardened volcanic stone that dictated the city's shape and temperament. At its western summit loomed Edinburgh Castle, a brooding mass of walls and towers fused into the black crag beneath it. Time had gnawed at its stones, yet it remained unbowed. Every scar on its surface spoke of sieges endured, banners raised and torn down, cannons fired into the night. The castle was not merely a fortress. It was a symbol carved into the skyline, a constant reminder that authority in Edinburgh was born from strength, vigilance, and bloodshed. From the shadow of the castle spilled the Royal Mile, a long, sloping ribbon of stone that ran eastward like the city's single beating artery. It was crowded, noisy, and alive from dawn to dusk. Merchants shouted from wooden stalls, carts rattled over uneven cobbles, and the air carried the mingled scents of smoke, leather, sweat, and refuse. This road linked power to power, descending steadily toward Holyrood Palace, where monarchy took on a more refined and ceremonial face. Between castle and palace, soldiers, nobles, craftsmen, beggars, and thieves all passed one another daily, bound together by the same narrow stretch of ground. Within this confined space, the city pressed inward on itself. Edinburgh could not sprawl like other European cities, hemmed in as it was by defensive walls, marshland, and steep slopes. With nowhere to expand, it chose to rise. Stone tenements climbed skyward in tight clusters, 6, 7, sometimes 10 stories tall, their narrow facades looming over the streets like sheer cliffs. These buildings ranked among the tallest residential structures in Europe, and they were packed with life at every level. Society stacked itself vertically. The wealthy claimed the lower floors, closer to the street, where access was easier and light more generous. As one climbed higher, The air grew colder and darker, the rooms smaller, the rent cheaper. At the very top lived the poorest residents, families wedged beneath sloping roofs, hauling water up endless staircases and descending again to reach the street. Rich and poor shared walls and stairwells, separated not by distance but by altitude. Threading between these towering blocks were the closes, narrow passageways that branched off the Royal Mile like veins. They were steep, damp, and perpetually dim. Sunlight struggled to penetrate their depths, and the walls seemed to sweat with age and moisture. Sounds echoed strangely there, footsteps lingering longer than they should, whispers carrying farther than intended. Refuse was often dumped into these passages, and the smells of rot, smoke, and human waste clung stubbornly to the stone. The closes were arteries of necessity and secrecy alike, places where daily life unfolded unseen and where danger could linger just out of sight. This was Edinburgh as the new century began. A city compressed by geography, stratified by height, and defined by stone, shadow, and endurance. It was restless, crowded, and intensely alive. A place where power loomed overhead and humanity pressed together in the dark spaces below. A city of sound and smell, Edinburgh, in the year 1700, did not merely exist in silence or stillness. It roared. Sound wrapped itself around the city like a living thing, pressing into every close stairwell and crowded room. Church bells dominated the hours, their iron voices tolling from dawn to dusk. They marked the rhythm of daily life, announced deaths and weddings, warned of fires or unrest, and summoned the faithful with an authority that could not be ignored. Their echoes bounced off stone walls and lingered long after the final peal faded. Below the bells, the streets churned with constant noise. Merchants cried out their wares in sharp, rehearsed calls, competing for attention amid the crush of bodies. Horses' hooves struck the cobbles in uneven rhythms, pulling carts heavy with coal, timber, or food. Blacksmiths filled the air with ringing blows as hammer met iron, sparks flying like brief stars against the gloom. From open windows spilled the unfiltered sounds of human life. Quarrels between spouses, drunken laughter, the hacking coughs of the sick, the thin crying of infants, and at times the low, exhausted sobbing of those who had nothing left to lose. The smells were even harder to escape. Refuse was tossed directly into the streets, where it mingled with mud, animal droppings, and stagnant water. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows with a shouted warning, "Gare-de-lou," a cry meant to spare passers-by from being drenched in filth. Not everyone heard in time. The result was a street surface slick with decay, especially after rain, when everything flowed downhill toward the lower quarters. Beneath the castle lay the Norlock, once a defensive barrier meant to protect the city from attack. By 1700, it had become something else entirely. Its waters were dark, slow-moving, and foul, choked with sewage, rotting waste, and the runoff of daily life. The stench rose constantly, especially in warmer weather, hanging over nearby streets like a curse. Few dared approach its edges, yet its presence was unavoidable, a visible reminder of what the city discarded and could not escape. Disease seemed to live in the air itself. Though the Great Plague outbreaks belonged to earlier decades, their memory remained sharp and close. Older residents still spoke of sealed houses, red crosses painted on doors, and carts rolling through the streets to collect the dead. The fear had not vanished with time. Every cough, every unexplained fever carried dread with it. Illness was seen not only as a physical threat, but as a moral one. Many believed sickness was sent by God, punishment for sin, greed, or disobedience. This fear shaped behavior. People prayed harder, judged their neighbors more harshly, and watched for signs of divine anger in failed harvests or sudden deaths. Hunger and sickness walked side by side, and the boundary between survival and collapse was thin. Edinburgh breathed noise and odor without pause, a city alive in every sense, yet constantly reminding its people how fragile that life truly was. Faith, above all, in Edinburgh, faith was not confined to church walls or reserved for the Sabbath. It ruled every hour of life. Religion shaped thought, speech, clothing, relationships, and reputation. Scotland stood firmly under Presbyterian doctrine, and Edinburgh was its spiritual engine, the city where belief was enforced with the greatest intensity and vigilance. Here, religion was not a private matter of the heart. It was public, visible, and relentlessly supervised. At the center of this authority stood the kirk. Its power reached far beyond sermons and prayer. Church elders acted as moral guardians, watching the population with sharp and unblinking eyes. They monitored behavior as closely as magistrates watched crime. Adultery, drunkenness, gambling, blasphemy, idle swearing, sexual impropriety, and even flamboyant dress could bring punishment. Excessive vanity, too much laughter, or neglecting church attendance were seen not as personal choices, but as threats to the moral health of the entire community. Those who failed to meet the kirk's standards faced public humiliation. One of the most feared punishments was enforced repentance. Offenders were made to sit upon the stool of repentance, placed in full view of the congregation during Sunday worship. There, exposed and silent, they endured the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. The purpose was not mercy, but correction through shame. The message was clear. Sin was not merely between an individual and God. It was an offense against society itself. Sermons were long, uncompromising, and emotionally intense. A single service could stretch for hours. As ministers thundered from the pulpit about judgment, salvation, and eternal punishment, hellfire was described in vivid detail. Damnation was not an abstract concept, but a looming reality, waiting for those who strayed from the narrow path. Congregants sat on hard wooden benches in unheated kirks, listening in silence, afraid not to absorb every word. To be inattentive was to risk suspicion. To disagree was unthinkable. Life in Edinburgh unfolded beneath a constant sense of spiritual surveillance. God was believed to see everything, and the Kirk claimed the authority to interpret His will. Every hardship was examined for meaning. Disease, famine, sudden death, and disaster were rarely viewed as random. They were signs, warnings, punishments sent from above. The city lived under the weight of divine judgment, and fear shaped obedience as effectively as law. Yet faith was not only a source of control, it was also a refuge. In a world defined by hunger, cold winters, disease, and uncertainty, belief gave people something solid to cling to. It offered structure in chaos and purpose in suffering. The promise that pain had meaning, that hardship would be rewarded in the next life, helped many endure what might otherwise have been unbearable. Prayer provided comfort where medicine failed. Scripture gave hope where the future seemed cruel and unstable. For the people of Edinburgh, faith was both chain and shelter. It constrained behavior, demanded conformity, and punished weakness. But it also explained the unexplainable and softened the harshness of daily survival. In a city built of stone and shadow, belief was the invisible force pressing down on every life, shaping how people lived, suffered, and endured. After the fall of a dream by the year 1700, Scotland was a nation carrying fresh wounds that had not yet begun to heal. Only a few years earlier, hope had burned brightly in the Scottish imagination. The Darien scheme had promised salvation. It was meant to lift Scotland from poverty and place it among the great trading powers of the world. A Scottish colony in Central America, strategically positioned to control trade between oceans, seemed like a bold stroke of destiny. Instead, it became a catastrophe. Ships sailed with investors' money, with farmers' savings, with the ambitions of an entire nation packed into their holds. What returned were stories of heat, disease, starvation, and death. Thousands of Scots perished in the swamps and jungles of Darien. Those who survived came home broken, carrying tales of betrayal, incompetence, and despair. The money was gone. Almost all of it. Fortunes, built over generations, vanished in a few bitter years. Edinburgh felt the collapse like a blow to the chest. This was the city of merchants, lawyers, financiers, and traders, and many of them had invested everything they owned. Businesses failed overnight. Shops closed. Once respected families slipped suddenly into poverty, their names no longer spoken with admiration but pity. Credit dried up. Trust dissolved. The sense of national confidence cracked, and with it came a dangerous question. Could Scotland survive on its own? Anger simmered, and much of it was directed southward. Many Scots blamed England, accusing it of deliberately blocking support for the Darien colony to protect its own trading interests. Whether true or not, resentment hardened into bitterness. Independence, once a source of fierce pride, now felt fragile. The dream of standing equal among nations had collapsed. Edinburgh remained proud, stubbornly so. But pride does not fill empty stomachs, and stone walls do not comfort those who have lost everything. Markets, taverns, and survival. Yet even in hardship, the city did not stop breathing. Each day, markets spilled into the streets, noisy and crowded, despite the strain on wallets and bellies. Traders arrived with sacks of oats and barley, baskets of fish hauled in from the coast, bundles of wool, and stacks of animal hides. Prices fluctuated constantly, and bargaining was sharp, sometimes desperate. For the poor, food was monotonous and thin. Bread was dark and coarse, often stretched with whatever grain was available. Meat was a luxury, tasted rarely, perhaps on a holy day or after an unusually good week. Ale flowed more freely than clean water. Brewing was safer than trusting the city's polluted wells, and even children drank small beer, weak but nourishing. Taverns became essential spaces, warm refuges from cold rooms and colder streets. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and voices. Candles flickered against stained walls as mugs thudded on rough wooden tables. These taverns were more than places of drink. They were the city's unofficial parliament. News traveled quickly there, passed from mouth to mouth. Rumors mixed with facts. Pamphlets were read aloud. Arguments flared and cooled and flared again. Men debated Scotland's future with clenched fists and raised voices. Should the country cling to independence at all costs? Should it seek union with England for economic survival? Had pride already cost too much? No one agreed. No one truly knew. But in a city starved of certainty, opinion was abundant. Women, work, and the weight of life for women in Edinburgh. Survival demanded relentless labor. Life offered little mercy, especially to those without wealth or protection. Most women worked from necessity, not choice. They brewed ale, baked bread, washed clothes, carried water, sold goods in the markets, and took in sewing. Many worked from dawn until nightfall, their labor essential, yet rarely acknowledged. Widows were particularly vulnerable. Without a husband's income, many were forced into poorly paid work or charity. Some ran small stalls. Others took lodgers into already crowded rooms. A few, pushed by desperation, turned to prostitution, risking punishment from the kirk as well as violence from clients. There was little space for compassion. Poverty was often treated as moral failure rather than misfortune. Marriage offered some security, but it also meant constant childbirth and the ever-present risk of death. Infant mortality was high. Grief became a quiet companion, endured rather than openly expressed. Strength was expected. Silence was survival. Despite this, women held communities together. They shared food when they could, watched one another's children, and exchanged news in closes and stairwells. Their lives were heavy with responsibility, yet they endured with a stubborn resilience that matched the city's stone foundations. Edinburgh in 1700 was not merely a place of grand buildings and political debate. It was a city held together by ordinary people navigating hunger, loss, faith, and uncertainty. Dreams had fallen, but life pressed on, step by step, through markets, taverns, and shadowed closes, as the city waited, unknowingly, on the edge of enormous change. The weight carried by women in Edinburgh bore burdens that were heavy, constant, and rarely acknowledged. Survival demanded labor, and most women worked not for fulfillment, but because there was no alternative. They scrubbed clothing as washerwomen in freezing water, their hands raw and cracked. They brewed ale in cramped kitchens, tended stalls selling cloth, bread, fish, and small goods, and carried heavy baskets through steep streets and closes. Many managed entire households alone, while husbands searched unsuccessfully for work or drifted between short-lived employments. Widowhood was common and feared. War, disease, workplace accidents, and hunger claimed men with brutal efficiency, leaving women to carry on without protection or income. A widow's life was often a narrow one, balanced on the edge of respectability and ruin. Without family support, she might be forced to take in lodgers, beg, or accept work that barely kept starvation at bay. Charity existed, but it was limited and often conditional on moral judgment. Opportunities for women were tightly constrained, and reputation was everything. A single accusation could destroy a life. Whispers of immorality spread quickly, in a city built on proximity and suspicion. Though the great witch hunts of earlier decades had faded, their memory remained vivid. Women still remembered neighbors dragged away, tried, and executed on the thinnest of evidence. The language of witchcraft had softened, but fear endured, reshaped into accusations of scandal, sin, or improper behavior. Fear did not vanish with time. It learned to whisper instead of shout. It lived in sideways glances, in the silence after a rumor, in the knowledge that safety could disappear overnight. Learning in a harsh city, yet Edinburgh was not only a place of hardship and control. It was also a city where ideas stirred beneath the weight of tradition. The University of Edinburgh, founded in 1582, was steadily gaining prestige, drawing students from across Scotland and beyond. Within its narrow rooms and candlelit lecture halls, young men studied medicine, law, philosophy, and theology, grappling with questions that stretched beyond inherited belief. Books passed from hand to hand, some worn thin from use, others carefully hidden. Professors lectured in cold chambers, their words echoing off stone walls as they introduced new ways of thinking about the body, the mind, and the natural world. Learning was rigorous and often conservative, but change had begun. Curiosity pressed against doctrine. Observation challenged superstition, though always with caution. The Scottish Enlightenment had not yet fully taken shape, but its foundations were being quietly laid. Reason, inquiry, and skepticism crept forward slowly, careful not to provoke open conflict with the Kirk. Old beliefs did not vanish. They stood alongside new ideas, uneasily sharing space in the minds of students and scholars alike. The old world and the new existed together, not in harmony, but in tense coexistence. Nobility and narrow streets along the Royal Mile. Nobles still walked with measured authority, cloaked against the cold and guarded by servants. They moved through the city as figures apart. Their townhouses rose tall and severe, built from dark stone, their facades largely unadorned. Wealth was not displayed through decoration, but through scale, thickness of walls, and distance from the street. Security mattered more than beauty. As night fell, the city dimmed rather than slept. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting trembling pools of light on wet stone. Shadows filled the closes, and danger moved easily through them. Theft, assault, and drunken violence were common, especially after dark. Watchmen patrolled with limited authority, their presence more symbolic than effective. Justice, when it came, was harsh and uneven. Punishments were swift, public, and meant to instruct through fear. Executions drew crowds, serving both as warnings and grim entertainment. The gallows reminded everyone of the cost of disobedience, even as curiosity pulled people closer. Edinburgh was never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours of night, footsteps echoed, voices murmured, and the city's many lives pressed on in darkness. Stone absorbed sound, but it never held it for long. The city remained awake, watchful, and waiting. Edinburgh at the edge of change. At the dawn of the 18th century, Edinburgh perched uneasily between past and future. The city was ancient, proud, and steeped in faith. Its identity carved from stone, ritual, and memory. Every street and tenement told stories of survival, of sieges endured and storms weathered, of ambition measured against the limits of rock and ridge. Yet beneath that proud exterior, the city was fragile. Wealth was unevenly distributed, trade uncertain, and hunger never far from the door. Medieval streets wound tightly between towering buildings, as narrow as the lives of those who lived within them. Laws were strict, moral surveillance unrelenting, and social mobility constrained by custom, faith, and circumstance. In less than 2 decades, Scotland would face a decision that would alter its course forever, whether to unite with England. At this moment, however, the people could only live in the present, unaware of what history demanded. All they knew was hunger gnawing at their bellies, hope flickering in small victories, fear lurking in every cough, and shadow and faith that gave shape to suffering and strength to endurance. Step by step, stone by stone, they moved forward, each day a careful negotiation with life itself. Dawn over the Royal Mile morning in Edinburgh was never gentle. The sun crept reluctantly over the Firth of Forth, its pale light failing to penetrate the lower streets where tenements crowded together in shadow. Smoke coiled from countless chimneys, carrying the smells of peat fires, bread baking, and boiling water. The city began to stir with a low, persistent symphony of survival. Children running barefoot to fetch water from public wells, women sweeping ashes and refuse from doorways, apprentices hurrying to workshops, bracing for the strap or the sharp word of their masters. Above it all, on its jagged volcanic perch, Edinburgh Castle loomed, unyielding, eternal, silent witness to every human triumph and failure below. It watched over the Royal Mile, over the markets, the taverns, the closes, and the stairways, its presence a reminder of authority, history, and the unchanging rhythm of stone. Edinburgh did not sleep long. In this city, survival demanded movement, attention, and resilience from the moment light touched the rooftops. The closes, where life truly lived behind the grandeur of the Royal Mile, lay the closes, narrow, twisting alleyways that descended steeply into shadow. Here, sunlight was a rare visitor, disappearing by mid-morning and leaving the stone walls damp, dark, and pungent with the mingled odors of rot, smoke, and human presence. Life in the closes was intimate and unrelenting. Families crowded into single rooms, sharing beds, tables, and air. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. A cough could echo from floor to floor. A shouted quarrel could become public knowledge within minutes. Yet the closes were more than hardship. They were the beating heart of community. Neighbors shared firewood, bowls of broth, and scraps of news. Illness spread quickly, but so did care. When a child fell sick, a neighbor fetched herbs, lent bedding, or helped the mother carry water. In these narrow streets, life was raw, immediate, and honest. There were no illusions of grandeur, no pretensions of comfort or refinement. The Royal Mile displayed power, wealth, and authority. The closes showed the truth of Edinburgh, resilient, gritty, and alive, one cramped room at a time. Every echo, every footstep, every whispered word in these alleys carried the pulse of the city. Here, Edinburgh breathed not as a living, breathing organism, endlessly enduring, endlessly struggling, endlessly human. Food, hunger, and the memory of famine in Edinburgh. The fear of famine in Edinburgh, the fear of hunger lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Only a few decades earlier, Scotland had suffered devastating famines. Crops failed repeatedly, and entire families went without sufficient food for weeks or months at a time. Tales of empty bowls, rotting potatoes, and desperate acts were still fresh in memory. In 1700, that fear had not vanished. Food remained precarious, a daily concern that shaped choices, behavior, and social tension. Oats were the backbone of survival. Porridge in the morning, oatcakes in the evening. These simple, filling staples were consumed by rich and poor alike, though the quality and quantity varied sharply. Meat was rare, almost a symbol of celebration rather than sustenance, reserved for wealthier homes or occasional holy days. For those near the coast, herring and other fish provided some relief, but even then, supply could fluctuate wildly with the weather and season. When food became scarce or prices rose too high, the city's restrained civility could break quickly. Bread riots, though dangerous, were not uncommon. Hunger sharpened anger, and a desperate populace could lash out at bakers, merchants, or authorities alike. A city that went hungry was a city on edge. Each stomach ache, a spark, each empty pot a threat to order. Survival shaped daily life in Edinburgh as surely as stone shaped its streets. Disease and death In the shadowed streets, plague had passed, but death never left Edinburgh. Smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, and other illnesses thrived in the city's crowded, damp, and poorly ventilated homes. In tenements stacked 6 or more stories high, disease could move silently from floor to floor, leaving families broken and grieving. Medical knowledge was limited. Doctors bled patients, prescribed herbs, and often relied on prayer and superstition rather than science. Many remedies were as likely to harm as to heal. Funerals were common and grimly routine. Processions wound through narrow streets, following the departed to churchyards bursting with bodies. Graves were shallow, and sometimes the dead were stacked to make space. Children played beside the markers, oblivious, while adults whispered prayers for protection. In Edinburgh, life and death existed in constant proximity. Every cough, every fever, every pale face could signal the end, a reminder that mortality was never distant. Justice, punishment, and public fear. Justice in 1700 was immediate, severe, and unmistakably public. The Tolbooth prison, a grim stone fortress near St. Giles Cathedral, symbolized authority and terror. Within its thick walls, prisoners awaited trial, punishment, or execution, often for weeks under harsh conditions. Crime was met with swift retribution, and punishment was meant to be seen. Executions were not private affairs. Crowds gathered to watch hangings, public floggings, or other forms of capital punishment. Children perched on shoulders to see better. Vendors sold bread and ale to those who came for both curiosity and necessity. The spectacle was intended to instruct through fear. The message was clear. Order would be maintained at any cost. To live in Edinburgh was to navigate not only hunger and disease, but also the shadow of authority, always visible, always exacting. In 1700, Edinburgh was a city of extremes: narrow streets and soaring tenements, faith and fear, poverty and resilience, life pressed up against death. Every day demanded vigilance. Every step carried risk. And yet, the people endured, moving through hardship with a stubborn persistence. Stone by stone, breath by breath, surviving the weight of the city and the world it reflected. Taverns, where words became dangerous if the kirk ruled the soul. The tavern ruled the tongue. In dim rooms, thick with smoke and ale, men debated fiercely. Politics, religion, England, Scotland's future, nothing was off limits. These conversations were dangerous. Informers listened. A careless word could lead to arrest. Yet frustration ran deep, especially after the failure of Darien. Scotland felt cornered. The question that divided the city by 1700: One question dominated every serious conversation: should Scotland unite with England? Some argued union was betrayal, the death of sovereignty, culture, and pride. Others saw it as survival, access to English trade, protection, and stability. Edinburgh was divided street by street, household by household. The tension was quiet, but intense, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Nobles, power, and quiet deals behind heavy doors and shuttered windows. Negotiations began in earnest. In candlelit chambers, Scottish nobles gathered in hushed circles, their voices low, their expressions tight with worry. Many were drowning in debt, their estates crumbling under poor harvests, failed colonial ventures, and years of mismanagement. Political pressure mounted from every side. For these men, union was not always a matter of loyalty or betrayal, but survival. Some saw it as a lifeline, a chance to restore wealth and influence. Whispers of bribes drifted through corridors like smoke. Promises of titles, pensions, and favor were exchanged in private, far from public scrutiny. The common people remained largely unaware of the bargains being struck above their heads. They sensed only unease, a growing feeling that decisions shaping their lives were being made without them. Power did not announce itself. It moved quietly, deliberately, and without mercy. Education and the first sparks of enlightenment, while politics simmered in secrecy, another force was beginning to stir within the city. In lecture halls, taverns, and private homes, scholars and curious minds gathered to question long-held beliefs. They studied the workings of nature, the human body, and the principles of reason and philosophy. These thinkers believed that knowledge could lift society from ignorance and superstition, that progress was possible through learning. Books circulated hand to hand, ideas debated late into the night. Edinburgh, still bound by narrow medieval streets and ancient stone walls, was slowly transforming into a city of intellect. The past clung to its architecture, but the future was forming in thought, argument, and curiosity. Change was not marching in with banners. It was thinking its way into existence. Women and unseen strength. Women rarely appeared in official documents or grand histories, yet they were the city's quiet foundation. They brewed ale and baked bread, sold goods in markets, and kept households alive through endless labor. They raised children in cramped rooms, tended the sick during outbreaks of disease, and prepared the dead for burial when life slipped away. In times of hunger, illness, or unrest, it was women who stretched meager resources and held families together. Their work was constant, exhausting, and largely invisible. Their strength went unrecorded, their voices unheard in councils of power. Yet without them, Edinburgh would have fractured and fallen apart. The city survived because they endured nightfall and fear. When night fell, darkness claimed the city quickly. Lanterns cast weak, trembling light along uneven streets, and doors were bolted shut as the sun disappeared. The closes grew narrow and threatening, filled with shadows and uncertainty. Thieves prowled, drunkards stumbled, and desperate souls drifted through the darkness, unseen and unpredictable. Fear settled in with the cold. Yet even under cover of night, life did not stop. Quiet prayers were whispered behind closed doors. Laughter slipped softly through thin walls. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing what little comfort they could find. Despite danger and hardship, Edinburgh endured. Stone by stone, breath by breath, the city survived another night. A city on the brink. In the year 1700, Edinburgh did not yet know its fate, but it could feel it. Change was coming, political, economic, intellectual. The old world was cracking, slowly, painfully. Soon, Scotland would sign away its independence. Soon, the city would expand, clean itself, and reinvent its identity. But in 1700, Edinburgh remained a city of stone, smoke, and stubborn hearts. This was not a golden age, but it was a defining one. From these narrow streets would rise a city of thinkers, builders, and reformers. From hardship would come brilliance. From shadow, light, and that transformation was only beginning. The Union, the uprising, and the birth of a new city. The years that followed, tension without release. After 1700, Edinburgh lived in a state of quiet strain. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. No armies marched through the streets. No bells rang to announce the end of an era. Instead, the city waited. Waiting was familiar to Edinburgh. Waiting for harvests. Waiting for sickness to pass. Waiting for God's judgment. But this waiting felt different. It was political, heavy, unspoken. Every merchant, craftsman, preacher, and laborer sensed it. Scotland could not continue as it was. A kingdom in debt, the failure of the Darien scheme, had crippled the nation. Edinburgh's merchants were ruined. Noble families struggled to maintain estates. The government faced debts it could not repay. Trade was restricted by English laws that shut Scotland out of global markets. Independence, once a source of pride, had become a financial trap. England, meanwhile, was growing richer, stronger, more centralized. To many in power, the conclusion became unavoidable. The Act of Union takes shape by the early 1700s. Negotiations intensified. Scottish commissioners traveled, Letters were exchanged, and agreements drafted in secret. The proposed solution was radical. Scotland and England would become one kingdom, one parliament, one crown, one future. In return, Scotland would receive access to English trade and colonies' financial compensation for Darien losses, political stability. On paper, it seemed logical. On the streets of Edinburgh, it felt like betrayal. The people react when news spread, anger followed. Crowds gathered near Parliament Close. Pamphlets circulated, accusing politicians of selling the nation for gold. Tavern debates turned explosive. Cries echoed through the Royal Mile. "We are sold for English gold." Effigies were burned. Stones thrown. Riots broke out across the city. Edinburgh, usually controlled, disciplined by the Kirk, erupted. This was not rebellion against hunger or plague. This was rebellion against loss of identity. Fear among the elite, the ruling class, grew nervous. Guards were increased. Troops stationed nearby. Doors bolted earlier at night. Some members of Parliament feared assassination. Others fled the city temporarily. Yet the vote continued. Power does not wait for approval. 1707. The Union is signed. In January 1707, the Act of Union was ratified. Scotland ceased to be an independent kingdom. Edinburgh lost its parliament. The decision was legal. It was constitutional. And to many Scots, it was unforgivable. Church bells did not ring in celebration. Instead, the city fell into a bitter silence. Aftermath: a city wounded in the years that followed. Edinburgh struggled. Many politicians moved south to London. The city felt abandoned, reduced from capital to provincial center. Yet something unexpected happened. With politics gone, ideas took their place. The rise of the Scottish Enlightenment, freed from constant political struggle, Edinburgh turned inward toward thought, education, and improvement. Universities expanded. Medical schools flourished. Philosophers, scientists, and economists emerged. Names that would soon change the world. David Hume, Adam Smith, James Hutton. The same city, once choked by medieval filth, became a laboratory of reason. Edinburgh transformed from a city of survival into a city of ideas. A new Edinburgh is born by mid-century. The city began to rebuild itself. The new town was planned. Wide streets, clean air, elegant buildings. The medieval chaos of the old town gave way to Enlightenment order. Stone still ruled, but now it symbolized progress, not confinement. The city that once feared the future began to design it. Looking back to 1700, and yet none of this would have been possible without the hardship of 1700, without the hunger, without the failure, without the fear. The people of Edinburgh endured one of the most uncertain periods in their history and survived. Edinburgh in the year 1700 was not grand. It was dark, crowded, and unforgiving, but it was resilient. From its narrow closes came strength. From its sermons came discipline. From its losses came wisdom. The city did not disappear after the Union. It evolved. And today, when you walk its streets from the Royal Mile to the New Town, you walk across layers of struggle, sacrifice, and stubborn hope. This is Edinburgh, not just a city of stone, but a city that refused to break, end,